But your flags and boots and uniforms, they start to all smell the same when all sides are killing in the Patriot game. And that's how it's done. And you've got our sons in the crosshairs of horror at the end of your guns. And your national anthems, they start to all smell like shame when all sides are dying in the Patriot game. It's just a war racket. That's just a war racket. It's just a war racket. And that's a war racket. And war is never, ever whole.
It is now 30 minutes past the hour, and we welcome Mr. Joseph Distefano. I wanted to start out with a quote that I hope he will address, and we're speaking specifically about an article that he wrote, but the quote is, "The man posing as, quote, middle-class Joe, end quote, has built his career and his family's wealth on an eagerness to serve not the many Americans crushed by credit card debt, but the very banks whose hands are around their throats," end quote. With that, I'd like to welcome Mr. Joseph Distefano.
Good morning, California.
Hey,
very nice to be here with you.
I have to ask, you're in Philadelphia.
Yes, I am. I've lived most of my life in the Philadelphia area, and for a large part of that in Delaware, which is Senator Biden's, Vice President Biden's home state.
Right.
Very well known here.
Yes. Well, of course, we want to look at your recent article, and you actually have written several articles on Vice President Joe Biden's, support of the middle class. He calls himself Middle Class Joe, and I think even one point in your article you say he's the only person that calls himself that. Talk about the article. What made you? You typically write about companies and businesses and investment banking. So I guess this kind of bleeds into his history and his political history. Talk about the article and what's important on there.
Sure. Well, I've written for the Philadelphia Inquirer for most of the last 30 years, since at the Wilmington News Journal down in Delaware and at Bloomberg News up in New York, among other places. And the senator, Delaware is a very interesting place politically because it's quite small. A lot of people in California resent the fact that we have two senators, same as you, and even though there are fewer than 1 million people here, we could all fit in one congressional district. We only have one congresswoman. By the way, the entire delegation is Democratic at this point, and the representative is an African-American woman, even though the district is more than three-quarters white, which is a rare thing in America. So this is a fairly progressive electorate as American electorates go. And Joe Biden represented it in the U.S. Senate for 6 terms. He was elected as a very young man and left to become vice president.
Right.
And so, we know a lot about him. When I took my kids to late Mass, he would sometimes show up there with a Secret Service detail after visiting his mother up in Greenville, Delaware. And, everybody has Biden stories just like everybody has DuPont stories in Delaware, longtime residents do. And he is liked and admired by a lot of people here, and he is resented by a lot of people. There's a lot of folklore about him not paying his bills, a lot of those stories that I checked out, and found that they were either not true or impossible to verify. But what is true is that he has for a long time identified with the average American, the regular voter. And I think that it's pretty clear that if you review the record from the year he was elected at age 29 forward, that is not how he and his family, his brothers, and his kids have made their living. They are very much political creatures. They are very much people whose opportunities have existed within the government, and most especially in recent decades, in clients of the government, businesses, people that hoped to do business with Joe Biden and with the government through proximity to the family, and that this is the thing he has encouraged. And this happens a lot in America. It certainly applies to the Trumps. It applies to many other families. But there is a paradox here in that here's a guy who says he's middle America. Well, his father was most successful as a military contractor way back during World War II, and was not prosperous after that period. Sold cars and sold condominiums in Delaware, young Joe became a lawyer. There are some skin-of-his-teeth stories about him getting through college, but rather than serve in one of the big corporate law firms that dominate the legal sector in Delaware, he very quickly got into electoral politics at a very interesting time in this country when both the Democrat and the Republican parties in Delaware were falling apart, and got himself, he defeated a long-term serving, fairly liberal by Republican standards incumbent senator and represented the state decisively ever since then. And he cozied to the big industries here in Delaware. And the big industry at the time he was elected was chemicals, but the rising industry was banking. And he aligned his fortunes upside the largest of the banking sectors in Delaware, which was the credit card banking sector, and helped to make things possible for that industry. Lobbied very, very heavily to be able to increase its market share, to be able to increase its business, to be able to increase its hold on many sectors of society, especially the middle class. And Joe Biden, when he helped them, was helping Delaware, because that was a major employer. It was the rising employer in the state, and it's easy to see why he did it, and I can tell more about that or take it wherever you want to go.
All right. Well, in your article, Joe Biden's friends and backers come out on top at the expense of the middle class. You say that investigating the nature of Joe Biden and his son Hunter's business dealings in Ukraine is a legitimate endeavor. What do you mean by that?
Well, certainly. So a lot of what you're reading back to me is things that were written or added to the article by the editors at The Nation to kind of characterize the underlying findings, which are an illustration of many, but certainly not all, of the Biden family's business dealings since Joe Biden came into public service. And again, what we're saying here, there were other possible outcomes. For a very long time in this country, there were limits on the interest rates that banks could charge individuals, and those were substantially unwritten, overthrown during the Carter administration. We had a Democratic president and a Democratic Congress, and with the aid of the Supreme Court, the decision was made, even before President Reagan came in, to loosen those restrictions and allow the banks to charge a lot more. And there were arguments in favor of this by people who said, well, if you don't allow banks to charge what the market will bear, they will not make loans available to a lot of people, and those desperate people will have to borrow money, illegally from loan sharks and from, short-term lenders at much higher rates of interest, so that you're actually helping people when you allow banks to charge 25 and 30% interest. That was an argument that was made at the time and has been made since, but very much expanded so that with it, private debt to students, to credit card users, to mortgage borrowers has exploded in this country. If you follow the Federal Reserve records, some of which are linked to my story, you can see just how fast consumer lending has outpaced population growth and even wealth growth during that period. And so there, both on the right and on the left, there have been people who said this is a bad thing. On the right, you get a lot of moral arguments saying that, too much credit is not good for people, but you should, mostly spend as you earn. You go too far over your head, and a lot of people are going to end up defaulting. People are going to end up in debt service for life. And on the left, the argument is made that it's too easy for lenders to score enormous profits while impoverishing people by charging, whatever the market will bear, very high rates of interest. But the way this came down in Delaware was you had large companies from out of state. Delaware was almost the first state off the post in exploiting the new laws to gut its own consumer protections, to reduce its own bank taxes to the point where they are regressive. The more money you earn as a Delaware bank, the less you pay in income taxes as a rate. And he saw the opportunity there. The largest of the credit card lenders, MBNA, America Bank, its executives became his largest single group of donors for a long period of time. And at the first, they were on the defensive. They were trying not to have usury laws reimposed. And it's interesting to note that Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren got into a tussle long before she was in the Senate. She was a consumer lawyer and sometimes a corporate lawyer at Harvard University. And she came down to Congress to argue for restrictions on bankruptcy, basically protections for bankrupt people, restrictions on bankruptcy corporations, and how they could pressure debtors. And that Joe Biden was on the other side of the fence, was very much sticking up for the bankers who were his constituents.
So he basically...
Joe Biden and his aides have argued many times that, in fact, They were in the middle. They were negotiating. They were for the people. They were for the middle class, but they were just trying to make sure that the legislation that was passed was not totally pro-industry, had some provision, some moderation in there that tended to protect borrowers. And there are examples of that. But for the most part, it was the Republicans who pushed the pro-bank legislation. It was the Democrats who opposed it, and it was thanks to Joe Biden, and it was able to rally a handful of Democrats for a while, Bob Kerrey of Nebraska among them, that in the very well-balanced Senate of the 1990s and early 2000s, these laws did get through, culminating with the Bankruptcy Act that passed in 2004 and was enacted in 2005, that really gave the MBNAs and the credit card lenders what they wanted, which was effectively a non-discharge in bankruptcy of a lot of their loans, and make it very hard to go bankrupt as a result of credit card debt, of student loan debt, of certain other classes of debt. This is what the banks wanted, and if you look up the research done by economists at the Philadelphia Federal Reserve and some other institutions during the Great Recession, they identified that legislation that the Republicans and Senator Biden passed and President Bush signed as a significant contributing factor to the mortgage bankruptcies that happened because people could not get some of their medical, their student, some of their credit card loans discharged, so that put them in a position where they couldn't pay their mortgage loans either.
So he was part of opposing the government regulations and oversight, and that therefore this is what happened.
Well, Congress collectively cut that deal, and they cut that deal a little bit earlier when Clinton was president and the Democrats lost control of Congress. What you had was basically that was a lot more direct. That was a question of mortgage lending. And the people on the left argued about redlining, that too many Americans were not able to get mortgages because they were black, because they were poor, because of where they were located. They were good credit risks, but they had to pay very high rates because they could not establish credit, and that was a problem, and that the way you solved that was to force lenders to lend to everybody in the Community Reinvestment Act, which passed way back in '77, but as interpreted in the 2000s, that this should be, in the 90s and 2000s, that this should be, this should force banks to make mortgages to poor people as well as rich people. Well, you need a lot of regulation if you're going to make that work. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of loans to people who genuinely cannot pay their loans off, and to speculators who have nothing to do with poor people that come in under the easy money laws and rules. The Republicans, on the other hand, were totally against that level of regulation and said that you can trust the banks to regulate themselves. They're not going to go broke. Alan Greenspan was a big proponent of that view.
Right.
Phil Gramm, Democrat turned Republican. Clinton and the Secretary of the Treasury, Larry Summers, accepted that, and Joe Biden was among the people who went along with it because it was good for the banks. The banks were big employers. They were considered basically responsible. But what you had in the 2000s is a lot of lenders who were not as responsible go out and make loans. They were very disconnected from the lender, and the customer became decoupled. Loans were bought and sold in very large quantities, regardless of their credit characteristics. And so you kind of had the worst of the left, which was lend to everybody, even if they're not creditworthy, and the worst of the right, which is don't regulate anybody very heavily. And that led to the blow-up of 2008. But by 2008, Joe Biden had moved his own position somewhat to the left, for example, in the matter of student loans. And that was because he was no longer going to be running as a senator. He was going to be running for vice president nationwide, and the big contributors to the Obama campaign in the Democratic primaries, as well as to the Clinton and the Republican candidates, were people at investment banks in New York. We've now moved on, from the consumer lenders like MBNA, which actually got sold to Bank of America and incorporated in a much larger company. Now you had the investment banks playing a much more aggressive role in politics and in pushing for policies that would give them more products to sell. And so Joe Biden, looking at not so much the donors but the Democratic electorate and the people who vote in primaries, took a position that was seen as very pro-student, and that was against the private sector lenders, student lenders, the largest of which, Sallie Mae, was actually moving to Delaware in those years. So if he had been, there were people in Delaware who were much more pro-Sallie Mae. The governor of Delaware, Jack Markell, who was effectively a Biden ally. Biden did not back the party's choice for governor that year, and a lot of his donors went over to elect Jack Markell instead. Markell was very much pro-bank. And so, the argument of the Democrats was They weren't at first about fixing the problems with consumer loans, with credit card loans, with mortgage loans, but they did want a government takeover of student loans. So government takeovers of student loans tend to happen when you have Democratic presidents. Under Clinton and again, and back in the 70s, and again under Obama, there was a move to loans would be made directly by the government. They would only be serviced by private companies. And Biden went along with this. So that was, in that instance, he did move to the left because he was looking at an electorate that was farther left. When he was pro-credit card bank in the 70s and 80s and 90s, he was representing Delaware, where the banks were popular. When he was moving to restrict student lending, profits, he was looking at a national student electorate. And so he showed he is capable of responding to where the politics comes from. Interestingly, his son, Beau Biden, his political heir, one of his kids who really, one of the few people in the Biden family who really seemed to have made a go at an independent professional career that was not dependent completely on political connections. Of course, he ran for office in Delaware with a lot of his father's donors. But once he was in office, Beau Biden also kind of moved to the left and stood up with Schneiderman, the state attorney in New York, saying we need to go after these bankers who have provoked the credit crisis of 2008. We need to go after these people personally. And Delaware's governor, Jack Markell, the Democratic establishment nationally, and the Obama administration, Eric Holder, all these people did not want to do that. They were very defensive of the banks. They did not want to, panic the banks and force them out of business. They really protected those bankers who by and large did not go to jail and were very seldom prosecuted.
Right. It's 46 minutes past the hour. If you've just tuned in, this is Heroes and Patriots, and I'm speaking with Joseph Distefano. He is a staff writer for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and we are talking about an article that's essentially is Biden versus the middle class. You touched upon Beau Biden. A lot has been made as we've gone through impeachment about Joe Biden's son, Hunter. Can you address, and you feel that this should be investigated, talk to us about that part of the family, if you will, and a state-run Bank of China?
Well, there are a couple of tragedies in the Biden family that are very well known, and one of them is the death of his wife and two younger children right after his first election in a car accident, which he has at times mischaracterized as a drunk driving accident by the other party, in which it was not. And the second, the tragic death of his son, Beau, right when he was getting ready to run for governor of Delaware, right when he was getting ready, in some respects, to fill his father's shoes. By Joe Biden's own admission, Beau Biden had many of his virtues and few of his vices. He's kind of an improved version. He was a young man with a lot of political connections, but also an independent political future. And his very untimely death was a real blow, obviously, to his father. Suffered it, wrote a book about it eventually. But there's a big difference between the Biden children. And the two older boys, Hunter and Beau is Joe the Third, was Joe the Third, was older, the oldest. They went to their father's alma mater, Archmere Academy, which is this elite prep school nominally run by the Norbertine priests up in the former home of the DuPont Company's first chief financial officer, John J. Raskob, who, by the way, was chairman of the Democratic Party in the 1920s when another member of the DuPont family, Coleman DuPont, was chairman of the National Republican Party. So, the duality of the parties and the connections through Wall Street being a lot closer than a lot of people like to acknowledge. This goes way back. And, Biden has an obvious connection to that. It's a coincidence maybe that, he went to high school in the guy's house. And he sent his sons there and his daughter eventually also. And what classmates will tell you is that Joe Biden III, Beau Biden, was a very likable kid. He was smart. He took seriously what the Norbertines taught about social justice, which for a lot of people, they go through the motions. But, he really seemed to understand it and kind of get it, that there was a public service role that involved serving large numbers of people and helping them get opportunity and democracy, really, having their views represented at the government. Hunter was more remembered as the party boy, the one who ran around with the really rich kids in the really nice cars. And there are all kind of accusations thrown at him. But the bottom line is that people remembered Joe as a guy you could safely invite to a party, and the girls liked having him there, and they didn't think they were going to get harassed or otherwise, and nobody was going to get sold a bunch of drugs. And you couldn't always say that about everybody in the family. So it's a shame that they lost Bo, and then here's Hunter, who just seems to travel from personal crisis to personal crisis all the time, enjoying the benefits of being, part of this family. He and some other, when his father went out of office, his father was vice president, he and some other kind of young Democrats, stepson of John Hines, others detailed in my article, and others, at a time when the Obama administration was promoting this investment rapprochement with China, do business here and there, they got involved with some Chinese government and some private Chinese funded investment organizations, and the whole idea was to buy both to facilitate U.S. investments in China and facilitate Chinese investments in the West. And some of the companies they got involved with, as we look back from the Trump administration, when U.S. investments in China are viewed with such extreme skepticism, even though the Fortune 500 have been investing in China now for 30 years. There's very large factories that DuPont and others have all over China. Yet today, it is very politically suspect when you go over there and try to make an investment. But in the early 2010s, here were these guys, lending their names and in some cases their capital, becoming the part owners of these investment enterprises that, had they succeeded on the scale envisioned, would have made them very rich and may still have made them a good deal of money. Well, they went and they bought the biggest copper and cobalt mine in Africa, which is a big supplier for batteries. They bought one of the large battery technology companies in Detroit, which therefore became Chinese-owned and now is building its factories in China, presumably using copper and cobalt like that manufactured at the mine they helped them buy in China. They were involved in a nuclear technology company, two of whose U.S.-based engineers went to jail under circumstances that do seem suspect to me. I'm not sure the trial was entirely fair. But they were convicted of transferring technology to China without proper authorization and of taking steps to try and keep that hidden. And the engineer who went to jail on that actually lives a mile from Joe Biden's house in Greenville, Delaware. Most likely a coincidence. We don't know any personal connection between them.
Right.
But, company after company that this group was involved with, including Hunter Biden, turned out to have been, strategically very sensitive. The company that provides a lot of the technology that is used to track the Muslim and Uyghur citizens of China who have been put in concentration camps in very, very large numbers, who are the subject of an attempt to really remake society in China that is now being attempted in other parts of the country. Really horrific stuff by Western standards, by many Chinese standards. And this was a company that they invested in also. So looking back, on the one hand, you can't imagine why, this was not, big news at the time, why people did not blow the whistle on them. On the other hand, many American companies were doing the same, and that's how we did business in the Obama and the Clinton and the Bush administration.
I have an email that I'd like to share with you, Joe. Biden has supported laws that gave the soft drink industry an exemption for antitrust laws, limited the right of consumers to sue, giving only wholesalers the right to sue manufacturers for antitrust violations, allowed banks to expand across state lines. That was one of my questions, and allowed commercial banks to engage in risky security trades by repealing the decades-old Glass-Steagall Act. Do you want to comment on any of those? Those, of course, were history. Those are part of history.
Well, several of those are banking issues that we did address earlier in the conversation, and I think the caller is actually absolutely right. Whether or not the Glass-Steagall Act could be successfully repealed at this point, there's two different kinds of banks. We look at them historically in America: commercial banks and investment banks. And commercial banks they used to call them the 363 banks. You lend money, you borrow money from the government at 3%, you lend it to local businesses at 6%, you're on the golf course by 3%. That's how that business used to work. Much more complicated today, but it's the same basic idea, is that you are out there lending to businesses and individuals.
Right.
And that's a commercial bank. And that business grows a little bit every year as the population grows, and you have to be very careful, because if you have more than a very few bad loans, the company starts losing money, loses its capital, and has to be rescued or sold out. Investment banks are a very different business in which you gather your own and investors' capital, you buy out companies, you help them, assist them in transactions, you find deals for them, you do the negotiation. You're paid 1 or 2% of the deal, which is a fabulous amount of money when you're selling, for example, Dow Chemical merging in with DuPont. And then you go on to the next deal, and there are years in which investment bankers make millions and millions and millions of dollars, and the successful ones, and there are years in which they really don't make much. And when you marry these very different kind of institutions together, you're taking on considerable risk. The commercial bankers don't understand the investment bankers, their privileges, their fast and famine. They're kind of feast and famine cycles. The investment bankers certainly don't understand the commercial bankers and the steadiness and the regulation that is to prevent the banks from blowing themselves up. That when you allow them to combine together, as the Senate and the House and the presidency did in the late 1990s, you are looking for trouble. And people who come from banking districts, and Delaware was a commercial banking district versus New York is these days much more of an investment banking town. They know this, so they ought to know this. They ought to see the risks. They ought to be the ones who speak out and tell why this has historically not been a good idea.
So if he does become president, let's say he is the Democratic nominee and beats Trump, that's the thought that only he could really beat Trump. I don't know if I agree with that, but what would you anticipate given his history, his background? Where do you think things would go?
So Joe Biden is a man of Washington. I mean, he is a guy who really understands how to get legislation passed, and he'll not do. How to compromise where effective compromises are. He understands a lot of the imagery that reaches the public, probably not as well anymore as Trump does. And so you can count on him to somewhat feel the nation's pulse and go out and act on it. If you look at what have been the crises of the Trump administration, policy toward China, I see nothing in Joe Biden's record that indicates he's going to be strong, with China, that he's going to defend American interests effectively with China. Maybe he'll be better than Trump at working with our allies, with the Japanese and the Koreans and the Europeans. But I've talked to diplomats who feel that Biden and the Clintons really ran roughshod over them in handling Libya, and way before that in handling Yugoslavia, and would be likely to repeat that again. So, a lot of the vices we attribute to Trump are vices that the Democrats showed maybe a more venial instead of a mortal nature. And as far as financial institutions are concerned, Trump has made a great deal of noise about banks and what ought to be done for them, but not a lot has been. And what has been done to ease up on regulations, the Democrats were heading in that direction anyway. So I'm not sure that policy would be radically different. Likely, Biden would try to pressure the Fed less than Trump does. And there are a lot of people who argue that in forcing low interest rates, Trump is really working on behalf of a lot of Americans who benefit from low interest rates. Would Biden be more likely to respond to the banks? Well, that is his history. He certainly is familiar with their arguments and probably a lot of the individuals that are making those arguments. So we can speculate and say, well, those are two areas in which, things are not necessarily likely to improve. Now, you can argue that more generally, Biden shows respect for the government, the people who work in government, which Trump does not, shows respect for their motives, believes that government is something that can make people's lives better, whereas Trump obviously believes that's true when it comes to subsidizing farms. He's given the biggest farm giveaways anybody has. Trump's soft on crime in certain areas. He likes to issue pardons to people who've been convicted of doing awful things.
Right.
Maybe President Biden would be more cautious in those kinds of areas. Maybe he would have more respect for the norms. Where have those norms gotten us is the question that a lot of voters ask.
Joseph Distefano, we are out of time. It went very, very quickly. I hope you will come back with some more interesting comments and opinions at a later time.
Bless you, and thank you for having me on your program. Go get 'em, California.
Happy New Year. Joseph Distefano is a staff writer for the Philadelphia Inquirer and the author of Comcast Said How Ralph and Brian Roberts Took Over America's TV, One Deal at a Time. The article that we have been speaking about, and you can certainly find on the web, is Joe Biden's Friends and Backers Come Out on Top at the expense of the middle class. That's today's first show of the new year. We thank you for tuning in. Again, the program will be archived at kmud.org and again along at on our website, heroespatriots.org. Have a good day.
The world's greatest power, and you team up with